So this month, there have been a lot of GPU announcements. Intel has already announced and released their Battlemage GPUs, whereas NVIDIA and AMD have done their announcements at CES, but they won't be launching their GPUs until closer to the end of this month. AMD has put Q1 2025, but a lot of people feel like it's probably going to be the end of the month. Same thing with NVIDIA. They've actually already said, I think, January 30th. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to grab all the GPUs that I have in this house, ones that are in computers, ones that have been sitting out, and compare them. So I have a card as old as 2007, and then my newest card is one from 2020. So, or 2021, I believe actually. So I want to kind of go through all of these cards. I did a little bit of benchmarking. Obviously, some of them didn't complete some of the benchmarks or weren't able to launch some of the benchmarks. There's going to be a really wide variance, but I do want to kind of go through all of them. And I also want to give you a brief history as to why I have some of these GPUs, because some of them are a little bit more interesting than others. So first, I just want to give some brief information about the GPUs that are coming this month or in Q1 2025. So as I mentioned, Intel launched Battlemage, and the B580 is being touted as an absolutely fantastic budget card. Right now, I believe at the $270 price point. A lot of reviewers have been giving it a lot of praise, and it seems to be doing really, really well at its price point. And Intel's kind of smoothed out some of their issues that they had, especially driver related, with previous launches. Now, NVIDIA is launching their 5000 series GPUs, and they are touting a lot of stuff about AI and a lot of things about upscaling. So it's going to be really interesting to see the performance of those when they do end up launching. They are claiming that the 5070 performs at the level of a 4090, but there's a little footnote there that says with AI. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens and how it ends up actually performing in real world use cases. We'll see what happens. Now, AMD has only announced two of their cards so far. They are comparing the Radeon RX 9070 XT to the GeForce RTX 5070 Ti, and they're comparing their 9070 to the 5070. So if you are looking to get one of the new GPUs, please don't rely on first-party benchmarks. They don't really mean anything. They could be using any kind of variables to make their cards look better. Take a look at when all of the third-party groups like Gamers Nexus and Jay's 2 Cents and any YouTuber or tech outlet out there is doing their benchmarks, and take a look at more than one. I really like Gamers Nexus, but looking at multiple creators and outlets' results when they're doing these benchmarks is really helpful, because you can see really how the card performs in different scenarios and the way that these people are all testing a little bit more differently from one another. So now let's quickly talk about some of the GPUs I have and a little bit of history on them. If you want to skip forward to the benchmarks, you can go ahead and do that. There will be timestamps everywhere, and I'll put one on the screen for you as well to make it a little bit easier. But I thought it was really interesting to talk about the history of some of the GPUs, especially since I have ones going all the way back to 2007. And the first one is my ATI Radeon HD 2600 Pro. Now, this came in an Acer pre-built that I bought. It was the first computer that I bought with my own money when working at a summer camp, and it worked really, really well for a couple of years. I ended up upgrading this a little bit later, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this was my first ever discrete graphics card that I had in a computer, and I was really proud of it. I was really happy that I had it. Surprisingly enough, it still works, and it was still able to run GTA. So we'll go over to that in a second as well. Really interesting card, and I still have it. All right, so I am actually a little bit shocked that this card actually still works. It's a card I bought, I think, back in 2007, maybe 2008. This is the resolution that it's supporting right now. It's not really working with anything else. It just kind of flickers black. It doesn't sound great, to be honest. It's actually the quietest it's been. But you can see that fan is wobbly. I tried to get it captured on the laptop there using a capture card. Wasn't taking it that at all. So I'm using my phone. But yeah, we can even see we've got the Catalyst software here. And you can see the games of the time when we go through. And you can see what's being pushed through Catalyst software at this period of time. This Catalyst software is slightly updated. I think it's from 2013 or so, but still quite dated. And I'm going to see if I can even get it to run a game. It's not doing well, but it's running. It's showing something. Now, the next part I don't actually have at the house right now. It is currently in a computer that I built for my parents so that they can do Excel and Word and their bills and stuff. But the GPU is a PowerColor HD 4650 512 megabyte version. This was the first ever upgrade that I bought for my computer, again with my own money. It came out in 2008. It's a pretty old card, but it's still working well. It's still doing the job. It does more than enough for my parents. And the reason that I put that in their computer instead of the Radeon 2600 Pro is because the PowerColor had a HDMI port on it. Now the next card's a little bit interesting because the GPU die that's in here was released in 2009, but the actual card itself wasn't released until 2011. And this is the GeForce 210. This is actually the Gigabyte model. This is one that was made for a lot of workstation computers. I ended up buying a workstation computer off of my mom's work. At their end of life, they would auction them off to employees, and then I ended up buying one. And honestly, nothing too special about this. It's cool because it's passively cooled. Not super powerful, doesn't have any additional power required. It just uses the power from the PCI slot. Does a good job. I've thrown this in many servers when putting them together and in a bunch of computers when doing troubleshooting. So it's still coming pretty handy. Does not support a lot of resolutions though. And it's really just a super backup card and one that's fun for videos like this. So the next GPU is one that I actually got off of a friend when I helped him build his new computer. He gave me his whole old computer as spare parts. Some of that is the one that I put together for my parents. And then the GPU here is the GTX 950. Now, not a super powerful card, but this was in my streaming PC for a while. And it does a pretty decent job. It's nice and small, so I can throw it into really small cases if I have to do troubleshooting. But it's still powerful enough to run a game, so I can do more tests and stuff. It's been pretty handy in the past. I've put this in the small form factor PCs that I've put together. It's kind of gone into everything. Nothing super special about it, but it does a good job. So here is the GTX 950 playing GTA, and you can see a really big difference in FPS compared to the previous cards. Now, funny enough, I actually had a pair of GTX 970s, Gigabyte WindForce edition ones. They were amazing. It was my first like really expensive, quote unquote, graphics card purchase that I ever made. And I ended up actually selling one of them to my friend who was building a computer and was trying to build one on a really tight budget. And then I sold another one to another friend who had their graphics card recently die. So those are the only graphics cards that I don't have in my possession anymore because I sold them, but from the same era as the GTX 950. Now the next card actually has the biggest box of the bunch, and it is my GeForce 1080 Ti Waterforce edition. I ended up buying this with a bonus that I got one year from work. This was my pride and joy, and it still is. It's still a fantastic card. It's being aged out quite a bit now, but it still does a really, really good job for a card that came out in 2017. And this thing is an absolute beast. I put it into the computer. I haven't used it in a while. I haven't used it since I upgraded to my current GPU, but it still works. It still does a very good job. And I don't think NVIDIA is ever going to make the mistake that they made when they released the GTX 1080 Ti. It was just such a powerful card. The price was right for the time. And even with inflation, it was still a very, very well priced card. And it just was an absolute powerhouse. I didn't have to upgrade until the 30 series. I was super happy with this thing. It still does a really good job. And yeah, it's a beast of a card. All right, so we've got the 1080 Ti going. It is a water-cooled card, so we have the water cooler. I had to replace the fan on it many years ago, so it's using a Be Quiet fan that I got there, and it is manually hooked up to the motherboard, and I have it running at about 90%. And considering how old this card is, it still really punches well above its weight. It's doing a pretty good job with the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark right now. And yeah, this is probably one of the best video card purchases I think anybody could have ever made. but I definitely feel it was the best one that I ever made for sure. Now, next up is a GPU that I actually had bought for a friend off of Facebook Marketplace. Someone was selling this thing really cheap. It was under $100. It is the EVGA 1650 SC Ultra Gaming, I believe. Really good card for what I paid for it. Again, under $100. Did a really good job. My friend ended up giving it back to me once they ended up buying an upgraded GPU. So that was really nice of them. Again, this is just here as a backup in case I want to build a little computer and give it away to somebody. It's a pretty decent little card, and really sad that EVGA is gone, and really sad that this is the only EVGA card that I own. Now, the next GPU that I have is a Sapphire PULSE 5700 XT. This is actually one of my closest friends' GPUs. I ended up building his wife, or fiance at the time, a new computer, and she ended up getting this card for a little bit, and I bought him a new graphics card as a wedding gift. And then this one started giving them both issues. So she ended up getting a new graphics card, and I ended up taking this one to do some troubleshooting. Unfortunately, it did not work for any of the benchmarks. I still have yet to figure out what's actually wrong with it. Haven't taken it apart or anything. So a little bit sad, but this was a really good card when it came out. It did a really good job for the price point, and kind of sad that it's dead. Now, the next card is one that is actually in the computer that I'm recording this whole video on right now, and it is the MSI 1650 Super. That is the one that is in my recording and streaming PC. And the reason that's in there is because it has the NVENC encoders so that I can use NVENC when streaming, recording, and doing all that stuff. It's super, super handy. A really big upgrade over the previous graphics cards that I had in that computer. Before I had to use my CPU to do all the encoding and stuff, but now being able to use the NVENC cores on the GPUs, super handy, really happy about that. And nothing too special about that. I bought it secondhand right at the beginning of the pandemic. I was able to get a pretty good price for it. The person that was selling it was just upgrading. And I think I paid like $150 for it. Where considering what happened a couple months later with people just gouging prices on GPUs everywhere, I think I did pretty good. And it's still working, still doing a very good job, and we're using it right now. Now, the next graphics card is also currently in use. It is my gaming computer GPU, and it was my upgrade from the 1080 Ti, and the graphics card is the RTX 3080. I have the NVIDIA Founders Edition. Super, super happy with the card. I ended up having to send the first one back, and ended up having a memory issue at some point. The warranty replacement was really, really easy through NVIDIA. I didn't have any major issues. It ended up being a pretty quick process. I just threw the 1080 Ti back into the computer for a little bit. You know, lost a little bit of performance, or quite a bit of performance, but it was fine. It wasn't too long. And yeah, the 3080 has been an absolute powerhouse for me. I'm hoping to upgrade it at some point and maybe move the 3080 either into the streaming PC or into one of my ITX computers that I use with the TV downstairs. But yeah, the 3080 has been a great card. Super happy with it. And I got it at MSRP, which was super shocking at the time. I got it just after I got a new job and I got a signing bonus. And yeah, things were good back then. And the final card here is a PowerColor Hellhound 6700 XT. I ended up buying this secondhand off of Amazon, and I ended up paying $225 for this thing, which was a crazy steal for what this card is. This was actually originally the card I was going to give my best friend in his computer. I ended up buying him an upgrade. I ended up buying him the 6750 XT as the upgrade. And then this is the one that's actually been living in the ITX computer. It's a little bit big for an ITX build, but it's been working. It does a really good job. I would love to put this in a computer and give it to one of my sister's boyfriends at some point, which I might end up doing if I upgrade the 3080 and I end up shuffling some GPUs around. But this has been a really, really good card. I really do like AMD's options. I would have an AMD card in my main computer if I was able to afford something like the 7900 XTX or something, as I don't do any kind of NVENC encoding on my gaming computer, so I don't really need that ability. And AMD's been improving their encoding abilities as well with AV1 and stuff anyways. So I would really love to try them out and get more of a hands-on experience with the newer cards. But this has been a really good card. I've been super happy with it. It performs really, really well. And the PowerColor one in general, the cooling is fantastic. It's huge. It's got plenty of fins on it. It's done a really good job. So here's a quick table with a bunch of important specs or specs that I feel are important for a lot of these GPUs. And I have the reference models as well as the actual specific models in blue that I have with me. And I have the release dates, the launch price, the approximate launch price with inflation as of December 2024, so that we can compare how these GPUs at different price points compare to each other now, which is really interesting. The TDP, the base clocks, the boost clocks, the memory size, the memory type, the bandwidth of that memory, and then the outputs. And it's just really interesting to see how some of these things have changed over time. And one of the reasons I also wanted to show this is it's going to be apparent once we go through the benchmarks that comparing the amount of GPU cores, clock speeds, and a lot of different specs of GPUs can't really properly be compared generation to generation because of the way that the architecture and everything works. A GPU with a certain amount of CUDA cores one year, and if the next year another GPU has way more CUDA cores or way less CUDA cores, sometimes they'll perform even better. And we'll see that in some of the numbers. It's going to be super interesting, and just seeing how the wattage has changed over time is also really, really interesting. Also, a quick disclaimer before we head into the benchmarks. I don't have a proper benchmarking setup. I can't afford one right now. I was using an ITX computer that I have built as my little benchmark PC for this whole test with all of the different GPUs. Took a long time to get all of these things installed and pulled back out of that little case, but I was able to get it done. Also, if you'd like to see me do more videos like this in the future, more content like this with benchmarking, all that kind of stuff, please let me know down in the comment section below if it even interests you and if it is stuff that you'd like to see. And if it is, please consider supporting the channel in any way that you can, whether it's subscribing, liking videos, commenting on videos, or even supporting me on Patreon or Ko-Fi. I'd love to be able to afford to put together a good benchmark system so that I can have more accurate benchmark tests. And hopefully at some point in the future, maybe I'll even get more recent cards on launch so that I can do more relevant content instead of just this historical kind of content. But I do really appreciate everyone who supports me now. And without further ado, let's hop into some of these benchmarks. Really quickly, to give you the specs of the benchmark computer, it is running a 5600X at 3.5 GHz stock speeds. It's in a Gigabyte B550i AORUS Pro AX ITX motherboard. We're running Windows 11 on the 23H2 update, and I have 16 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 3200 MHz RAM. So in terms of our actual benchmarks, I ended up choosing 3 games and 1 synthetic test. I chose 3 games that ranged across quite a few years so that we can try to get at least everything participating in these tests, as well as just seeing how the different cards performed at different periods of time. So the first game is GTA 5, and I just ran the benchmark on there. All of the cards were able to participate in this benchmark. It does a pretty good job, but it is going to be a little bit CPU bound at some points, so we'll see that in the results. Some of these GPUs are a little bit overkill for GTA 5, and we'll end up seeing that. The next one is Red Dead Redemption 2. This one is basically an upgraded version of GTA in terms of its performance requirements from graphics cards. So we'll actually end up seeing quite a few changes here in terms of the trends for the GPUs and how they're performing, but unfortunately 2 of the cards did not work. And the final game was Cyberpunk 2077. This was a really interesting game to test because it is newer than majority of the cards that are in this lineup. But you know, some of the cards did a really good job. Some of the cards didn't do so great of a job. The game has been optimized quite a bit since its release, so it performs a lot better now than it did when it came out. And we'll talk about that more once we go through the actual results. And finally, for the synthetic benchmark, I did 3D Mark's Time Spy. This gives the least amount of variables between all of the cards. It's not real world stuff at all, but it does give some pretty interesting insights into how these different GPUs compare to one another when running the exact same thing. And I believe that Time Spy runs at 1440p, so we do get to see a little bit of a difference there. All of the other tests were ran at 1080p. And there are some pretty interesting results with Time Spy, so we'll go over that once we get to it. So the first benchmark I ended up running was Grand Theft Auto 5, ran it at 1080p, the balance preset, and all of the cards were able to run this benchmark, which was super impressive. A lot of them didn't run it very well, but they all were able to run it. So really surprised with those results. The orange and blue bars here are the min and max frames per second that all of the cards were able to achieve throughout the benchmark, and the green is the average. So as we can see, the 4650 and the GeForce 210 did not do very well. The 4650 did significantly better as an average than the GeForce 210, but they were still basically unplayable. They were well below 10 frames per second for a majority of the test, and only in very particular scenes or where something was super static were they able to get up to those like almost 30 frames per second marks. So pretty interesting to see. Once we go up to the 950 though, we saw a significant improvement. The game became playable, and more than playable actually. It was able to achieve an average of over 60 frames per second, which is great. But for a lower end card, I think it does a really good job. And if someone did want to build a computer to play GTA 5, even with GTA 6 around the corner, it's a really cheap and inexpensive card that you can grab to be able to do that. So once we get up to the 1080 Ti, we get a significant jump in performance. And this is where the CPU really becomes a bottleneck here. The 1080 Ti maxes it out as well as it can, an average of 171 FPS, which is fantastic. This is performing well above the preset. We were be able to max it out if we wanted to, but the lower cards wouldn't have been able to run the game at all. So just really interesting. And we can see the 1080 Ti outperform the 1650 and the 1650 Super, which, still held their own. They're still good cards. They still perform really, really well for this game at the balanced preset. They're not doing a bad job. And then once we get to the RTX 3080 and even the 6700 XT, we can see they're basically around the same level as the 1080 Ti was. So not really much of an improvement when upgrading to a much newer GPU. But again, that's because the CPU's being a bottleneck and the actual game here is the bottleneck as well. All right, so with Red Dead Redemption 2, again, we're running this at the 1080p balanced preset. VSync is off for all of these game tests, by the way. And again, unfortunately, the 2600 Pro and the 210 were unable to launch the game, so we weren't able to benchmark them at all. The 950 was only able to do the benchmark at 720p. The game wouldn't allow me to put the resolution any higher because it said that I didn't have enough GPU memory because it's only 2 gigs. So the 950, even at 720p, still performed the worst out of everything, which is to be expected. The 1080 Ti is actually struggling pretty hard here. It was maxing out at around 64 frames per second average, with the 70 FPS being the max. So this is the one game really where the 1080 Ti wasn't doing much better than some of the cards that cost significantly less than it in terms of the 1650 Super, for example, where it's only a 10 FPS difference in terms of averages. So really interesting to see that result. I played RDR2 with a 1080 Ti for a really long time and didn't really see results like that all too often, so it is a little bit interesting. Nonetheless, a very interesting result, but then once we get up to the RTX 3080, it's playing the game extremely well, 115 frames per second almost average, with 130 being the max, and dropping down to a low of 84, so that's really doable, very much playable in terms of the FPS, so it's really nice to see that. And then the 6700 XT does pretty well in terms of its averages and its maximum, but it had some pretty bad minimums of 55.51 as an average for the minimum over the course of all the runs that it does. Overall, these results are pretty interesting. You really are starting to see how the newer games are putting more demand on a lot of these graphics cards, and we'll see that even more so in the next tests, which was Cyberpunk, again at 1080p, medium preset, and we can really see these cards kind of stand out from one another here. There isn't anything that's really close to one another anymore. The 950 was barely able to run the game. The 1080 Ti was able to run relatively well considering its age. This is the card that I originally started playing Cyberpunk on when the game first launched. It was a much less optimized game at that point, and it was a little bit unplayable at times. Still had a lot of fun, and then I actually and then I ended up borrowing a 2080 from someone for a little while until I played through a little bit of the game. And then I actually ended up getting a laptop that was able to run Cyberpunk really, really well. So an average score of 92 frames per second with the maximum of 111 is actually pretty good, and it dropping to a minimum of 76 is pretty good. Again, this is a 1080p, and when I was playing it at 1440p, which is probably why I was struggling a lot more. But at 1080p, it does a pretty good job, which is impressive considering the age of the GPU versus the game. And it was a AAA game that was known to be graphically quite demanding, so that's pretty impressive. The 1650 and the 1650 Super both struggled quite a bit. They were not really able to achieve super playable frames per second. The 1650 Super was able to get above a 40 frames per second average at least, and didn't drop below 40 as a minimum over the averages, which was pretty impressive. But still, I wouldn't really consider this overly playable at 1080p. You'd want to be dropping it down to something lower or picking up a different card. Now, once we get to the 3080, this is where the 3080 really shines here. It sticks out quite a bit above all the rest of the cards in terms of its average of 155, the maximum of 199, and the minimum of 110. Now, I use the 3080 all the time to play the game at 1440p with no issues, and it runs around 120, so I'm pretty happy with it overall, and it's really flexing its arms here. And then we have the 6700 XT, which is still doing it at a playable frame rate. You could probably even play it on a relatively high refresh monitor and still have a pretty good time, with the average of 111 frames per second here. Pretty impressive overall. Now, in the synthetic time spy benchmark, we're able to really see a really simple way of kind of comparing these cards in terms of their overall capabilities, where unfortunately, again, the 210 and the 2600 Pro were unable to run this benchmark. And I wasn't able to run something a little bit newer like Steel Nomad because the GeForce 950 wasn't able to run that at all. So I ended up using Time Spy, and we can see a pretty significant jump through all of these cards. Between the 950 and the 1080 Ti, we end up getting a 356% change, or almost a 357% change, which is really, really impressive here. And then between the 1650 and the 1650 Super, we also get a 30% increase in performance, which is also really impressive considering the non-super versus the super models, which was really nice to see. And then again, from the 1650 Super upwards, it's a pretty large jump. It's almost a 3x jump in terms of performance. And then we lose a little bit with the 6700 XT, but it was a lower class card than the 3080. So the benchmarks were both surprising and unsurprising. It was really impressive to see the 1080 Ti still do a pretty good job almost 8 years later. It is the most expensive card, both at the MSRP and its inflation adjusted price. But for that price that I paid for it, it is still absolutely rocking it all these years later. And I did buy one of the most expensive versions of the card because it was a treat to myself at the time. But really seeing the RTX 3080 do a really good job and hold its own, but seeing the improvements between the 1650 and the 1650 Super over the course of all the tests was also really interesting. I didn't really expect to see that much of a difference between those two cards, but it really does go to show that the 1650 Super and the whole Super series, when those originally came out, were a pretty decent improvement over their non-Super variants, which was really cool to see. But also the 6700 XT is performing insanely well, especially for the price that I paid for it. But even its MSRP, it is a really, really good performing card. And again, I would have loved to have more recent cards. I cannot afford any graphics cards at the moment. But I would love to end up doing those a little bit more in the future. So again, if you guys want to see more content like this, please let me know down in the comments. And with all that said, I'm also curious, what did you guys think about this current video? Is this something that you're interested in? Did you like the way that I did it? Do you have any comments, feedback, suggestions for if I do this again in the future? Please let me know about all those down in the comment section below. But I do hope you found this video helpful, and if not, I at least hope you found it interesting. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and big thanks to you for watching the end of this video. You want to see any other videos where I talk about computer hardware and stuff like that, you can check out the playlist right up here. And as always, stay safe out there. I'll see you next time.